September 15th, 1944, 8:32 hours. The Pacific Ocean, 600 miles east of the Philippines. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, 20 years old from Mobile, Alabama, crouches in the hold of an Amtrak, an amphibious tractor, with 30 other Marines of Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment. The Amtrak's engine roars. The smell of diesel fuel mixes with salt spray and fear. Sledge grips his 60mm mortar tube, so tightly his knuckles turn white. In exactly 8 minutes, Sledge and 15,000 other Marines will land on Peleliu, a coral island 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, covered in dense jungle and riddled with limestone caves. Military planners have told them this will be a quick operation, 3 days, maybe 4. Intelligence estimates suggest 10,000 Japanese defenders, demoralized after months of American victories across the Pacific. Every part of this assessment is catastrophically wrong. The Battle of Peleliu will last 73 days. Not 3. American casualties will exceed 10,000, more than Tarawa and Saipan combined. The island will prove strategically unnecessary. Admiral William Halsey will recommend canceling the operation before it begins, but his recommendation will be overruled. And the Japanese defenders, far from demoralized, have constructed the most sophisticated defensive system yet seen in the Pacific War, a fortress built into coral rock that will redefine how America fights the rest of World War II. Sledge does not know any of this yet. He knows only that in 8 minutes, the Amtrak will lower its ramp on a beach codenamed Orange One, and he will run forward into whatever waits beyond the smoke. He wrote a letter to his parents last night, choosing his words carefully, tried to explain why a boy from Mobile, Alabama had joined Marines instead of accepting his appointment to the Marion Military Institute. He could not find the words. Some decisions cannot be explained, only lived with. The Amtrak lurches forward. The ramp begins to descend. 6 months earlier, in March 1944, the combined chiefs of staff met in Washington, D.C. to plan the final 18 months of the Pacific War. 2 competing strategies dominated the debate, championed by 2 of the most powerful and most antagonistic commanders in American military history. General Douglas MacArthur, 64, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, argued for a direct thrust through the Philippines. MacArthur had fled the Philippines in March 1942 after Japan's invasion, leaving behind thousands of American and Filipino troops who were forced to surrender. He famously promised, "I shall return." That promise had become an obsession. MacArthur believed, correctly, that liberating the Philippines would restore American prestige in Asia and cut Japan's supply lines to the resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. Admiral Chester Nimitz, 59, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, championed a different approach. Bypass the Philippines entirely. Strike directly at Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, and the Ryukyu Islands, establishing air bases close enough to bomb the Japanese home islands. Nimitz's strategy would save time, save lives, and force Japan to surrender without the bloody liberation of every island MacArthur had lost in 1942. President Franklin Roosevelt faced an impossible choice between 2 brilliant commanders who despised each other. MacArthur viewed Nimitz's strategy as cowardice disguised as efficiency. Nimitz viewed MacArthur's strategy as ego disguised as strategy. Both men had valid points. Both men would accept nothing less than complete victory on their terms. Roosevelt chose compromise, the worst possible solution. MacArthur would get his Philippines invasion. But first, Nimitz would seize Peleliu and Angara in the Palau Islands, eliminating the Japanese airfields there, and protecting MacArthur's right flank during the Philippines campaign. This compromise satisfied no one, and condemned thousands of men to fight for islands that served no strategic purpose. Admiral William Bull Halsey, 61, commander of the 3rd Fleet, reviewed intelligence reports in early September and concluded that Peleliu's garrison had been reinforced and fortified far beyond original estimates. He recommended to Nimitz cancel the operation. The risks outweigh the benefits. Nimitz agreed, but felt he could not overrule MacArthur's planning without causing a command crisis. MacArthur had already committed forces. Ships were already loaded. Men were already briefed. Changing plans now would delay the Philippines invasion and give MacArthur ammunition to claim Nimitz had sabotaged his strategy. So the operation proceeded, not because it was necessary, but because it was inconvenient to cancel. This decision would haunt every commander involved for the rest of their lives. While American admirals debated strategy in air-conditioned conference rooms, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, 43, commander of the 14th Infantry Division, reinforced, prepared his defense of Peleliu with meticulous precision. Nakagawa was not a typical Japanese officer. Most Japanese commanders in 1944 still believed in the samurai code. Meet the enemy at the waterline, die gloriously in banzai charges, never surrender. This code had led to catastrophic defeats at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam. Entire garrisons were annihilated in suicidal charges that achieved nothing except spectacular casualty figures. Nakagawa studied these defeats and drew radical conclusions. The American way of war was simple: isolate the island with naval blockade, pound it with naval bombardment and airstrikes, land overwhelming force on the beaches, and destroy Japanese defenders in open combat where American firepower advantages were decisive. Every Japanese defeat followed this pattern because Japanese commanders fought the way America wanted them to fight. Nakagawa would fight differently. He abandoned the beaches entirely. No troops at the waterline. No banzai charges. Instead, he withdrew his 10,900 soldiers into Peleliu's interior, specifically into Umerbegol Ridges, a series of coral limestone hills honeycombed with natural caves. Engineers spent months expanding these caves into a fortress. Living quarters, ammunition storage, hospitals, command centers, all connected by tunnels carved through solid coral. Some tunnels were large enough to drive trucks through. Others were crawlways barely wide enough for a man. All were invisible from the air. Nakagawa positioned heavy weapons: 47mm anti-tank guns, 75mm mountain guns, heavy machine guns, in cave mouths with interlocking fields of fire. He calculated exact ranges to every potential landing beach. He registered mortars to hit specific coordinates. He positioned snipers in elevated caves where they could observe without being observed. And he issued orders that would have been heretical to previous commanders: survive as long as possible, kill as many Americans as possible, make them pay for every yard, but do not die uselessly, live to fight tomorrow. This strategy required discipline that contradicted every instinct of Japanese military culture. It required soldiers to watch Americans land without firing, to let them advance inland, to allow them to believe they had won, and then to bleed them slowly over weeks and months until the Americans questioned whether any island was worth its cost. Nakagawa had 10,900 men, 6 months of supplies, and terrain that made conventional assault suicidal. He calculated that his garrison would last 3 weeks before being overwhelmed. He was wrong. They would last 11 weeks. And when they finally fell, they would have forced the Americans to completely rethink their strategy for the rest of the Pacific War. Major General William Rupertus, 55, commander of the 1st Marine Division, briefed his officers on September 4th, 1944, 11 days before the invasion. His assessment was grimly optimistic. "Gentlemen," Rupertus told the assembled regimental commanders, "this will be a short operation. 3 days, possibly 4. We will land on the western beaches, seize the airfield, secure the southern end of the island, and mop up remaining resistance. Intelligence indicates the enemy is demoralized and lacks supplies. We expect opposition to collapse quickly once we establish a beachhead." Colonel Louis Chesty, Puller, 46, commander of the 1st Marine Regiment, listened to this briefing with growing unease. Puller was the most decorated Marine in Corps history, for Navy crosses earned in Nicaragua, Haiti, and Guadalcanal. He had fought in jungles, mountains, and coral atolls. He knew the difference between intelligence assessments and battlefield reality. Puller studied the reconnaissance photos of Peleliu's interior. The Umerbegol ridges looked like the surface of an alien planet. Jagged coral peaks, deep ravines, no vegetation visible on the heights. Artillery observers called it Bloody Nose Ridge because its profile resembled a boxer who had lost too many fights. Puller called it something else: a fortress built by nature and improved by a competent enemy. "General," Puller said carefully, "I recommend we extend our preliminary bombardment. 3 days isn't sufficient to reduce fortified positions in terrain this complex." Rupertus shook his head. "The Navy has allocated maximum ordnance to the preliminary bombardment. Admiral Oldendorf assures me his battleships will destroy every defensive position before we land. We won't need extended bombardment because there won't be anything left to bombard." Puller did not argue further. He was a Marine, not a naval officer. If the Navy said their guns could reduce Peleliu to rubble, he would take them at their word. But he increased his regiment's ammunition load by 20% and ordered his battalion commanders to prepare for extended operations. 3 days might be the plan. Puller prepared for 3 weeks. The 1st Marine Division comprised 3 infantry regiments: the 1st Marines, Puller; the 5th Marines, Colonel Harold Bucky Harris; and the 7th Marines, Colonel Herman Hannikin. Total strength: approximately 16,000 men, reinforced by the 81st Infantry Division Army, held in reserve. The plan called for a simultaneous landing by all 3 regiments along 3 beaches on Peleliu's southwestern coast. 1st Marines would land on White Beach, the northern landing zone, seize the northern end of the airfield, and push inland toward the Umerbergal ridges. 5th Marines would land on Orange Beach Center, seize the southern end of the airfield, and push east across the island. 7th Marines would land on Orange Beach, southern section, swing south, and clear the southern tip of the island. The operation was codenamed Stalemate 2, an oddly prophetic name that would prove more accurate than anyone intended. September 12th to 14th, 1944. For 3 days, the most powerful naval force that assembled in the Pacific War hammered Peleliu with everything modern warfare could deliver. Battleships USS Pennsylvania, USS Maryland, USS Mississippi, USS Tennessee, and USS Idaho fired their 14-inch and 16-inch guns at point-blank range. 6 miles offshore, close enough that Japanese observers could see the muzzle flashes. Each shell weighed over 2,000 pounds. They hit with the force of small earthquakes, creating craters 30 feet deep. Heavy cruisers added their 8-inch guns to the bombardment. Light cruisers fired 6-inch guns. Destroyers fired 5-inch guns. The noise was continuous, apocalyptic, a thunder that never stopped. Marines watching from transport ships 3 miles offshore could feel the concussion from naval gun fire through the steel hulls of their ships. Carrier aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, Helldivers, made bombing runs every 4 minutes. They dropped 500-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, napalm canisters. The napalm ignited the jungle, sending walls of flame across the island. From the ships, Peleliu appeared to be burning from end to end. Navy spotters calculated that over 1,500 tons of high explosive and incendiary ordnance struck Peleliu in 3 days. This exceeded the tonnage dropped on many European cities during the strategic bombing campaign. Surely nothing could survive this. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, 58, commander the bombardment group, signaled Major General Rupertus, "I believe we have destroyed all enemy defensive positions. You may land the landing force confident that enemy resistance will be negligible." This assessment was catastrophically wrong. The bombardment had destroyed Peleliu's surface, buildings, vegetation, anything above ground. But Nakagawa's fortress was underground, carved into coral rock that could withstand anything short of nuclear weapons. The Marines watching the bombardment from their ships believed they would land on a wasteland where nothing lived. They were about to discover that Peleliu's defenders were not only alive, they were waiting with loaded weapons and registered firing coordinates. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, watching the bombardment from the USS Mount McKinley, wrote in his diary, "The island looked like it was being torn apart. We thought nothing could survive this. We were wrong." At 8:30 hours on September 15th, 1944, the first wave of Marines climbed into their Amtraks and headed toward the beaches. They expected a walkover. They received hell. 8:32 hours. The first wave of Amtraks crossed the line of departure, their diesel engines roaring as they churned through calm tropical waters toward Peleliu's beaches. Eugene Sledge crouched in his Amtrak with the rest of Company K's mortar section. Around him, Marines checked weapons, adjusted gear, stared at nothing. Some prayed. Others vomited from fear or seasickness or both. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The Amtraks reached the reef, a coral barrier 400 yards offshore that extended around most of Peleliu like a natural moat. The tractors climbed over it, grinding their treads against jagged coral, then plunged back into deeper water. Marines grabbed handholds to avoid being thrown around the interior. Equipment clattered. Someone's rifle fell with a metallic clang. 300 yards from shore. 200 yards. The beach was visible now. White coral sand, dark jungle beyond. Smoke drifting from a bombardment. Still no enemy fire. Maybe the bombardment had worked. Maybe, at 150 yards, Peleliu exploded. Every weapon Colonel Nakagawa possessed opened fire simultaneously. Artillery shells, 47 millimeters, 75 millimeters, began landing among the Amtraks with devastating precision. Machine gun fire raked the assault waves. Mortar rounds fell in calculated patterns. The Japanese had registered every yard of the approach, had prepared firing coordinates for months, and now they executed their plan with mechanical efficiency. The Amtrak, carrying Lieutenant Colonel Russell Hansowitz, 32, commander of 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, took a direct hit from a 47 millimeters anti-tank round. The shell penetrated the thin armor, exploded inside, and killed everyone instantly. The Amtrak burned, drifted, sank. Hansowitz's body was never recovered. Other Amtraks reached the beach and lowered their ramps. Marines sprinted forward into a storm of fire from positions they could not see. Japanese defenders were invisible, hidden in caves, in reinforced bunkers, in spider holes. But their fire was devastatingly accurate. Men fell in the first seconds, hit by machine gun fire before they cleared the ramp. Others made it to the beach and dug behind whatever cover they could find. Logs, coral outcroppings, shell craters from the bombardment. The beach was not sand. It was coral gravel that provided zero concealment and minimal cover. Every movement kicked up white dust that drew fire. The temperature was 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The combination of heat, fear, and physical exertion was overwhelming. Men who had trained for months in perfect physical condition collapsed from heat exhaustion within minutes of landing. Colonel Chesty Puller landed with the second wave on White Beach, the northern landing zone assigned to his first Marines. He stepped off the ramp, took 3 steps, and immediately grasped the tactical situation. His regiment was landing in a kill zone. Japanese fire came from elevated positions inland, from the Emerbagal ridges that dominated the entire landing area. Every Marine on the beach was exposed to observe fire from positions that the naval bombardment had failed to touch. Puller's radio operator, Corporal Russell Clay, 19, from Texas, followed him off the Amtrak and was immediately hit in the shoulder by machine gun fire. Clay fell, blood spreading across his dungarees. Puller dragged him to cover behind a disabled Amtrak, applied a field dressing, and called for a corpsman. Then he got on the radio to his battalion commanders. Push inland immediately. We're dead if we stay on the beach. By 9:30 hours, 1 hour after the landing, elements of 5th Marines had pushed 500 yards inland and reached Peleliu's Airfield, a relatively flat area in the center of the island that had been the primary objective for D-Day. The airfield was a moonscape, cratered by the naval bombardment, littered with destroyed Japanese aircraft, the runway broken into chunks of concrete. But it was open ground, which meant Marines could maneuver, could see the enemy, could fight in ways that made sense. Captain George Hunt, 27, from Pennsylvania, commanded Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Hunt's objective was a point, a coral outcropping on the left flank of Orange Beach that jutted into the ocean like a stone finger. Intelligence photos showed it was undefended. Intelligence was wrong. The point was a fortress. Japanese engineers had carved firing positions into the coral, positioned 5 heavy machine guns and 2 47mm anti-tank guns to cover the beaches, and connected everything with tunnels. Hunt's company, 195 men, assaulted the point at 10 o'clock hours and immediately took casualties. Corporal John Teskovich, 23, from Pennsylvania, was killed by machine gun fire in the first minute. Private First Class Louis Lineweber, 19, from Ohio, was killed 30 seconds later. Private Andrew Tatum, 20, from California, was hit in both legs and bled out before corpsmen could reach him. Hunt reorganized his company and tried a different approach. Suppress the visible firing positions with rifle and machine gun fire, then send small teams with demolition charges to destroy each bunker individually. This was slow, dangerous work. It required Marines to advance under fire, place satchel charges at cave entrances or bunker apertures, then withdraw before the explosion. Many did not withdraw in time. Private First Class Arthur Jackson, 19, from Ohio, volunteered to assault a bunker that had pinned down Hunt's 2nd platoon. Jackson crawled forward with 2 satchel charges, canvas bags each containing 40 pounds of explosives. He reached the bunker, threw the first charge of the firing slit, and dove for cover. The explosion killed the 3 Japanese machine gunners inside. Then Jackson crawled to a second bunker, repeated the process, and survived. He would receive the Medal of Honor for this action, and for the 12 enemy positions he destroyed single-handedly over the next 4 hours. By nightfall on D-Day, Company K held the point, but at devastating cost. 157 casualties out of 195 men, an 80% casualty rate in 8 hours. Hunt survived, though he was wounded twice. Jackson survived. 38 men from Company K survived unwounded. The rest were dead, wounded, or evacuated for heat exhaustion. While the 5th Marines fought for the airfield and the 7th Marines pushed south, Colonel Puller's 1st Marines faced the worst terrain on Peleliu. The Emerbagal Ridges, which Marines immediately renamed Bloody Nose Ridge, and then stopped using proper names altogether, referring to individual coral peaks simply by number: Hill 100, Hill 140, Walt Ridge, 5 Sisters, 5 Brothers, the Horseshoe. These hills were not hills in any conventional sense. They were vertical coral cliffs 150 to 200 feet high, riddled with caves at multiple levels, connected by tunnels. defended by Japanese soldiers who had rehearsed every defensive position for months. Attacking them was like assaulting a multi-story fortress, where every window contained a machine gun, and every door was a tunnel leading to another defensive position. Lieutenant Colonel Rip Reagan, 38, commanded 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. On September 16th, D+1, he received orders from Colonel Puller. Take Hill 100, the southernmost peak of Bloody Nose Ridge. Reagan looked at the terrain through binoculars and understood immediately that this was not an infantry assault. This was a siege. But Puller's orders were clear, and Marines do not argue with orders. Reagan's battalion attacked at 10 o'clock hours. They advanced 200 yards before heavy fire from invisible positions stopped them cold. Reagan called for artillery support. The 11th Marines Division Artillery fired over 1,500 rounds at Hill 100 in 30 minutes. The shells hit the coral and exploded, sending fragments everywhere, but they did not penetrate the caves. The Japanese waited until the artillery lifted, then resumed firing. Reagan tried air support. Marine Corsairs made strafing runs, firing .50 caliber machine guns and rockets at suspected cave positions. The rockets exploded dramatically, but harmlessly against solid coral. The Corsairs pulled up, circled, made another run. Same result. Air power, the weapon that had dominated every Pacific battle since Midway, was useless against an enemy dug into solid rock. By 1600 hours, 1st Battalion had advanced 300 yards and suffered 150 casualties. They had not reached the base of Hill 100. They had not even reached clear observation of the peak. And as sunset approached, Reagan faced a new problem. His battalion was exposed on open ground with Japanese positions above and behind them. If he stayed, he would be annihilated during the night. If he withdrew, he would have to repeat this attack tomorrow. He withdrew. His Marines carried their wounded back to the battalion aid station, where Navy corpsmen worked by flashlight to stabilize men for evacuation. The dead were left where they fell. There was no time, no manpower, and no safe method to recover bodies under fire. They would retrieve them later after the battle. Some would not be retrieved for weeks. That night, Colonel Puller radioed Major General Rupertus. Estimate my regiment has suffered 30% casualties. Request relief by Army or replacement regiment. Rupertus refused. Continue the attack. This will be over in 2 days. It had already been 2 days. It would last 71 more. Private First Class Eugene Sledge experienced Peleliu not as a grand strategic operation, but as an endless series of small personal horrors. His memoir, With the Old Breed, published in 1981, would become the most visceral account of infantry combat ever written. But in September 1944, Sledge was simply a scared 20-year-old trying to survive hour by hour. Sledge's job was 60mm mortar gun for Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The 60mm mortar was a simple weapon, a steel tube, a base plate, a bipod, and high explosive shells weighing 3 pounds each. The crew consisted of 3 men, gunner, assistant gunner, and ammunition bearer. They fired by dropping shells down the tube. The shells arced high, then fell on targets behind cover, theoretically. In practice, firing mortars in the Ymerbergal ridges was nightmare geometry. The coral hills created dead spaces where shells could not reach. Japanese positions were often in caves with overhead cover that mortar shells could not penetrate, and the crew was vulnerable while firing, standing upright, visible, unable to take cover. On September 17th, D+2, Sledge's mortar section received orders to support an attack by Company K's rifle platoons against a Japanese strongpoint. Sledge and his crew set up the mortar on a coral shelf, about 300 yards from the target. His squad leader, Corporal R.V. Bergen, 24, from Texas, spotted for them. Bergen had fought on Guadalcanal and knew the job. Elevation 350 mils. Bergen called out, deflection 800. Sledge adjusted the mortar. His assistant gunner, Private First Class Vincent Santos, 18, from California, handed him a shell. Sledge dropped it down the tube. The shell fired with a hollow thump. 3 seconds later, it exploded on target or near target. Bergen observed. Left 50. Drop 50. Fire for effect. They fired 12 rounds in 90 seconds. Then Japanese counter-battery fire arrived, mortar rounds landing exactly where Sledge's crew had been firing. The Japanese had observers watching every American position, calculating ranges, directing their own mortars with precision. Move! Move! Bergen screamed. Sledge, Santos, and the 3rd crew member grabbed a mortar and ran. They displaced 200 yards, set up again, and resumed firing. This sequence, fire, displace, fire again, repeated throughout the day. By nightfall, Sledge's crew had fired over 100 rounds and displaced 7 times. Santos had been slightly wounded by shell fragments. Sledge was uninjured but exhausted beyond anything he had experienced in training. That night, dug into a shallow foxhole carved into coral, Sledge tried to sleep and could not. The heat was unbearable. The smell was worse, a combination of decaying bodies, coral dust, and human waste. There were no latrines on Peleliu. Men defecated where they fought, in shell holes or behind coral rocks. Flies swarmed everywhere. Sledge waved them away from his face and realized they had been feeding on corpses. He vomited, then drank from his canteen, then vomited again. This was Peleliu. Heat, thirst, fear, filth, and death. Not the heroic combat of war movies, but the grinding misery of men trying to survive in conditions that broke both body and mind. By September 21st, D+6, the 1st Marine Division had secured the airfield and the southern portion of Peleliu. The 7 Marines had cleared the southern tip of the island after vicious fighting, suffering 47% casualties in 6 days. The 5th Marines held the center, but the 1st Marines, Puller's regiment, was being destroyed against Bloody Nose Ridge. Puller's casualties exceeded 60%. Some companies had been reduced to 50 men, less than 1/3 their original strength. Battalion commanders rotated every 2 days as they were killed or evacuated for wounds. Company commanders lasted less than a day. Platoon leaders had a life expectancy measured in hours. And still the orders came: attack, seize the high ground, destroy the enemy. On September 21st, Major General Rupertus finally accepted reality and ordered the 81st Infantry Division Army to relieve the 1st Marines. This was a bitter pill for the Marines. They prided themselves on completing missions without Army assistance. But pride could not replace the 1,000 Marines dead and 3,000 wounded. The 81st Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Paul Mueller, 52, from Missouri, landed on Peleliu on September 23rd and began relieving Marine positions. The soldiers looked at the terrain and understood immediately what they were facing. Captain James Stoney Stanley, 28, from Oklahoma, commanded Company I, 321st Infantry Regiment. He walked the front lines on his first day and counted 217 dead Marines still lying where they had fallen, too exposed to retrieve safely. Japanese snipers waited for anyone who tried. How long have they been there? Stanley asked Marine Gunnery Sergeant. 5 days, the sergeant replied. Some longer. Stanley's company would spend the next 6 weeks attacking the same ridges that had destroyed the 1st Marines. They would learn the same lessons. Artillery is useless. Airstrikes are useless. Frontal assaults are suicide. The only way to reduce a Japanese K position is to crawl close enough to throw a satchel charge inside, or burn them out with flamethrowers. And even then, the tunnels allowed defenders to withdraw to another position and resume fighting. By early October, American commanders on Peleliu had developed new tactics specifically for cave warfare, tactics that would be used at Iwo Jima and Okinawa months later. The primary weapon became the flamethrower. The M2-2 flamethrower consisted of 2 tanks containing 70 pounds of napalm gel and compressed nitrogen. A gunner could fire a stream of burning gel up to 40 meters. Against Japanese positions in caves, flamethrowers were devastatingly effective. Not because they killed immediately, though they often did, but because they consumed oxygen. A burst of flame into a cave would suffocate anyone inside who could not escape through the tunnels. But using flamethrowers required getting within 40 meters of enemy positions, which meant assault teams had to close under fire. This was suicidal work. Flamethrower operators became priority targets. Japanese soldiers would hold fire until the flamethrower team was in the open, then concentrate all weapons on them. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator on Peleliu was measured in minutes during an assault. Private First Class Arthur Jackson, the same Marine who had destroyed multiple bunkers on D-Day, volunteered for flamethrower duty. On October 2nd, he assaulted a cave position on Walt Ridge that had stopped 2 previous attacks. He crawled forward with flamethrower and 30 pounds of demolition charges. Japanese machine gun fire kicked up coral dust around him. He reached the cave entrance and fired a sustained burst, 10 seconds of flame that sent fire 50 feet into the cave. Screams came from inside. Then silence. Jackson dropped the flamethrower, grabbed a satchel charge, and threw it into the cave. The explosion collapsed the entrance. He turned and crawled back under fire. Halfway back to friendly lines, A bullet grazed his helmet. He made it. 13 Japanese soldiers died in that cave. Jackson received his second Silver Star. The second innovation was a corkscrew and blowtorch method, developed by 81st Infantry Division tank crews. Sherman tanks equipped with flamethrowers would approach cave positions while riflemen suppressed the entrances with gunfire. The tank would fire its flamethrower into the cave mouth, the blowtorch. Then infantry would follow up with demolitions to collapse the entrance, the corkscrew. This method was slow, methodical, and relatively effective, though tank crews hated it because Japanese anti-tank guns could destroy Sherman with single hit, and the flamethrower tanks were high-priority targets. By mid-October, American forces had refined these tactics into a system: airstrikes and artillery to suppress known positions, tanks to provide mobile fire support, flamethrowers and demolitions to reduce individual caves, and constant pressure to prevent the Japanese from reinforcing or resupplying positions. But even with improved tactics, progress was measured in yards per day, and the cost remained brutal. On October 8th, tropical rains arrived, typhoon season in the Pacific. For 3 days, rain fell in sheets that turned Peleliu's coral dust into mud, filled foxholes with water, and made movement almost impossible. The temperature dropped from 115 degrees to 90 degrees, still hot by any standard except Peleliu's, where it felt like winter. The rain brought new miseries. Clothes never dried, rifles rusted, food spoiled, foxholes filled with water that had nowhere to drain on the coral island. Men sat in water up to their waists, unable to sleep, unable to get warm despite the heat, unable to do anything except endure. Eugene Sledge, now a veteran of 3 weeks of combat, sat in a flooded foxhole with Corporal Bergen and watched rain pour down. His hands were covered in coral cuts that had become infected. His feet had immersion foot from standing in water. His utilities were rotting off his body. He had not bathed in 3 weeks. He stank. Everyone stank. The smell of Peleliu was unforgettable. Rotting bodies, human waste, coral dust, rain, and underneath it all, the sweet, sick smell of death. How much longer? Sledge asked Bergen, who had been on Guadalcanal and knew that questions like this had no answers, just shrugged. Until it's over. When will that be? When they're all dead or we're all dead. This was the calculus of Peleliu. Kill or be killed. No third option. Surrender was not possible. Japanese soldiers did not surrender, and Marines had learned not to expect it. The only way Peleliu would end was when one side had been completely destroyed. And since America had replacements and Japan did not, the outcome was certain. The only question was how long it would take, and how many would die achieving it. By late October, Colonel Nakagawa's garrison had been reduced from 10,900 men to fewer than 1,000. They held a pocket of terrain approximately 400 yards long and 200 yards wide in the northern Ymerbergal, the last remaining portion of Bloody Nose Ridge that resisted American control. They had no supplies except what they had stockpiled months earlier. They had no hope of reinforcement or evacuation. They had no possibility of victory. But they fought with the same disciplined ferocity they had shown on September 15th. Every cave had to be reduced individually. Every position required flamethrowers and demolitions, and the defenders made Americans pay for every yard with casualties that mounted even as the end approached. On November 24th, 1944, 70 days after the landing, American forces finally overran the last Japanese positions. Colonel Nakagawa, recognizing that further resistance was meaningless, performed the ritual suicide expected of Japanese officers. He burned the regimental colors, sent a final radio message to Tokyo reporting that his garrison had fulfilled its duty, and then committed seppuku, ritual disembowelment, with his adjutant beheading him afterward. Nakagawa's last message read, "Our sword is broken. Our arrows are gone. We have fought to the last man. Please pray for our souls." His garrison had lasted 73 days. Not the 3 days predicted before the battle, but 73. They had killed or wounded over 10,000 American servicemen. They had forced the U.S. military to completely rethink its tactics for the final year of the Pacific War. And they had accomplished all of this defending an island that served no strategic purpose whatsoever. The most damning verdict on Peleliu came from the officers who planned and executed the operation. Admiral William Halsey, whose recommendation to cancel the operation had been overruled, wrote in his memoir, "Peleliu was unnecessary. We could have bypassed it. The losses we sustained there gained us nothing that we could not have achieved through aerial bombardment from carriers. The decision to proceed was one of the war's greatest mistakes." General Douglas MacArthur never publicly commented on Peleliu. but his private correspondence suggests he agreed with Halsey. The airfields on Peleliu were never used to support the Philippines invasion as planned. MacArthur's forces liberated Philippine airfields before Peleliu's facilities were even repaired. The strategic justification for the battle evaporated before the battle ended. Major General Rupertus, who had promised a 3-day operation, never recovered psychologically from Peleliu's outcome. He was relieved of command shortly after the battle and died of a heart attack in March 1945. Many who served under him believed the stress of Peleliu killed him as surely as Japanese bullets killed his Marines. But Peleliu's strategic failure should not overshadow its tactical lessons. The battle fundamentally changed how America fought the Pacific War's final year. In February 1945, 3 months after Peleliu ended, Marines landed on Iwo Jima, another small Pacific island honeycombed with caves. The Japanese defenders used the same tactics Nakagawa had pioneered. Withdraw from the beaches, fight from underground positions, make the Americans pay for every yard. But American commanders had learned from Peleliu. They brought specialized equipment. More flamethrowers, more demolitions, tanks with flamethrowers, armored bulldozers to seal cave entrances. They extended the preliminary bombardment from 3 days to 9 days. They prepared for a long battle instead of expecting a quick victory. Iwo Jima lasted 36 days and cost 26,000 American casualties, more than Peleliu, but the casualty rate was lower relative to forces engaged. More importantly, Iwo Jima's airfields proved strategically valuable, providing emergency landing sites for B-29 bombers returning from Japan. Peleliu's lessons had been learned and applied. Okinawa followed in April 1945, the largest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Japanese forces used Nakagawa's tactics on a massive scale. Cave positions, interlocking defenses, no bonsai charges, just disciplined resistance designed to maximize American casualties. The battle lasted 82 days and cost over 50,000 American casualties. But again, tactics developed at Peleliu proved decisive. Corkscrew and Blowtorch became standard procedure. Flamethrowers and demolitions were issued to every infantry company. And commanders accepted that cave warfare was slow, methodical work that could not be rushed. Eugene Sledge fought at Okinawa with the same company K that had fought at Peleliu. He wrote that Okinawa was worse, longer, bloodier, with more psychological casualties, but that Peleliu had prepared him for it. Men who survived Peleliu had learned to endure anything. They had learned that courage is not enthusiasm, but simply the decision to keep going when every instinct screams to stop. In July 1945, President Harry Truman faced the most consequential decision of the 20th century, whether to use atomic weapons against Japan or invade the home islands conventionally. Military planners presented casualty estimates for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, based on experiences at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The estimates were staggering, 400,000 to 800,000 American casualties, possibly more. Japanese casualties could exceed 10 million. The invasion would dwarf D-Day and potentially last into 1946. These estimates were not speculative. They were based on observed casualty rates from recent Pacific battles. If Peleliu, a tiny island with 10,000 defenders, cost 10,000 American casualties, what would Japan itself cost? The home islands had millions of defenders, mountainous terrain ideal for defense, and a population indoctrinated to resist to extinction. Truman authorized the use of atomic weapons. Hiroshima was bombed on August 6, Nagasaki on August 9th. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The invasion never happened. Whether Truman made the right decision remains debated. But the casualty estimates that influenced his decision came directly from battles like Peleliu. Every Marine who died on Bloody Nose Ridge, every soldier who died clearing caves with flamethrowers, contributed to the calculus that convinced American leadership that conventional invasion of Japan was unacceptable. Peleliu demonstrated both truths with terrible clarity. America could defeat Japan in cave-to-cave fighting, but the cost would be measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. Atomic weapons offered an alternative. Truman chose that alternative. And the Pacific War ended not with an invasion, but with mushroom clouds. In 1994, 50 years after battle, veterans of Peleliu returned to the island for a memorial ceremony. Fewer than 400 could make the journey. Most were in their 70s, and Peleliu was still remote, still difficult to reach. Eugene Sledge, 71 years old, walked the battlefields where he had fought as a 20-year-old. The jungle had reclaimed the ridges. The caves were still there, dark openings and coral cliffs, but they were empty now. The Japanese bunkers had been partially demolished or collapsed by time and weather. The airfield that thousands had died to capture was overgrown with vegetation. Sledge found a position where his mortar section had fought on September 17, 1944. He stood there for 20 minutes, saying nothing, remembering everything. When reporters asked what he was thinking, he said only, "I'm thinking about the ones who didn't come home." The memorial ceremony was attended by both American and Japanese veterans, old men now, who had tried to kill each other 50 years earlier. They shook hands. Some embraced. A few wept. They shared no common language except the language of combat, which transcends words. One Japanese veteran, through a translator, told an American Marine, "We fought hard. You fought hard. Now we are old. The war is over." The Marine, who had lost 2 close friends at Peleliu, nodded. "The war is over," he agreed. But for many veterans, the war was never truly over. The nightmares continued. The memories remained vivid. The smell of death, the feel of coral dust, the sound of Japanese machine guns. These things did not fade with time. They merely became part of the background, always present, never forgotten. Eugene Sledge died in 2001 at age 77. His memoir, With the Old Breed, had sold over 1 million copies and influenced an entire generation's understanding of infantry combat. Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks adapted it, along with Robert Leckey's memoir, into the HBO miniseries of Pacific in 2010, bringing Sledge's story to millions who had never heard of Peleliu. Sledge's genius as a writer was his unflinching honesty. He did not romanticize war. He did not present himself as a hero. He simply described what he saw, what he felt, what he endured, and his descriptions were so vivid, so precise, that readers could almost smell the decay, feel the heat, taste the fear. One passage from his memoir summarizes Peleliu better than any history book. The Japanese fought to win. It was a savage, brutal, primitive hatred, as characteristic of the horror of war in the Pacific as the palm trees and the islands. To the average American who fought in the Pacific, the Japanese were not merely a warlike enemy, but a hated and dangerous enemy. We existed in an environment totally incomprehensible to men behind the lines. This was Peleliu. Incomprehensible to anyone who was not there, unforgettable to anyone who was. Was Peleliu worth it? This question haunted every officer involved. Admiral Halsey said no. The island should have been bypassed. General Rupertus, before his death, privately admitted the operation should never have been launched. Major General Mueller, who commanded the Army's 81st Division, said the lessons learned justified the cost, though he wished those lessons had been cheaper. The Marines and soldiers who fought there generally refused to answer the question. They did their jobs. They followed orders. They survived or they did not. Whether politicians and admirals made the right strategic decisions was not their responsibility. Eugene Sledge came closest to answering when he wrote, "Peleliu was a nightmare. It was a hell that I try to forget, but cannot. Was it worth it? I don't know. I know only that we did our duty. We fought. Some of us survived. Others did not. That's all any of us can say." 60 years after the battle, military historians generally agree on 3 conclusions. First, Peleliu was strategically unnecessary. The island contributed nothing to the Philippines campaign and could have been bypassed with minimal risk. Second, Peleliu was tactically invaluable. The lessons learned about cave warfare saved thousands of lives at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Third, the men who fought at Peleliu displayed courage and endurance that deserve remembrance regardless of strategic failure. These conclusions are not contradictory. War is full of paradoxes. Operations can be simultaneously unnecessary and heroic. Mistakes can produce valuable lessons. And soldiers can do everything right while their commanders do everything wrong. Peleliu demonstrated both truths with terrible clarity. In the end, Peleliu mattered not for what it accomplished, but for what it cost. The 1,794 Americans who died there and the 10,695 Japanese who died there all died for terrain that strategic planners had concluded was unnecessary even before the battle ended. Their sacrifice purchased nothing except lessons about the price of strategic miscalculation. Those lessons, written in blood and coral, endure as Peleliu's true legacy. They remind us that courage cannot compensate for flawed strategy, that tactical brilliance cannot redeem strategic folly, and that the men who fight wars deserve leaders who commit them to battle only when victory serves a purpose worth the cost. The 1,794 Americans who died at Peleliu kept their promises. They did their duty. They fought with everything they had. They deserve leadership that made their sacrifice meaningful. Whether they receive that leadership remains the battle's most haunting question.